But would Stalin unbend as well? In fact, for Stalin, the ground was also shifting. He had just learnt that the Germans had routed Soviet troops on the Don River. Stalingrad, the great industrial city named after the Man of Steel himself, was now in Hitler's sights. Round 3 between Stalin and Churchill began at 7 in the evening in Stalin's office. The two leaders had a polite and businesslike final discussion about various aspects of the war. But as Churchill got up to say goodbye, Stalin became Mr. Nice Guy all of a sudden. "Why don't you come back to my apartment in the Kremlin and have a little drink, The little drink mushroomed into dinner with a dictator, a 6-hour feast washed down with endless bottles of choice wine. Stalin introduced Churchill to his daughter Svetlana and watched his reaction with a twinkle in his eye, as if to say, "You see, even we Bolsheviks have family life." The mood became progressively more unreal as conversation lurched from the present to the past. Churchill boasted about the military genius of his ancestor, the Duke of Marlborough. Stalin, with an impish smile, said he thought the Duke of Wellington was more talented because he crushed Napoleon, who presented the greatest danger in history. Then Stalin got on to the collective farms campaign and the criminal resistance of the peasants. It was, he said, a terrible struggle. 10 million people, all very bad and difficult, but necessary. He hacked at a pig's head, picking at the flesh with his fingers. Churchill had a vivid image of millions of men and women being blotted out forever. But he held his tongue. With the World War going on all around us, it seemed vain to moralize aloud. This final meeting cemented the alliance. Churchill left Moscow with a new confidence in Stalin. On the plane home next morning, nursing a massive hangover, he murmured, "I was taken into the family. We ended friends."
Of Joseph Stalin, the Prime Minister has brought back an excellent impression of a great rugged war chief, blunt of speech, with a saving sense of humor. The two formed a friendship which promises well for the victory of the United Nations.
In the course of the war, Churchill's view of the Soviet Union and the threat of what he called Russian barbarism would yo-yo up and down. But he retained his faith that Stalin was a man with whom he could do business. For his part, Stalin had played a shrewd game of hot and cold with Churchill, knocking him off balance. This was a routine Stalin ploy.
But I believe there was something more behind his Mr. Nice Guy act when he invited Churchill back into his flat. Stalin, I think, made a deliberate decision to open up, to show a more human side. The bruiser had to become a charmer. He couldn't afford to let the meeting end on a sour note because Russia's military situation had gone critical.
The Caucasus and Russian oil fields now seemed within Hitler's grasp. The decisive battle would be in the cauldron of Stalingrad,
where 2 million Soviet and German troops became locked in a struggle to the death. Churchill's much vaunted offensive in the Mediterranean, landing 100,000 troops on the beaches of North Africa, was a mere sideshow to this horrific climax of the war. Having failed to wipe Leningrad and Moscow off the map, Hitler was now determined to erase Stalingrad. His orders were stark: male population to be destroyed, female to be deported. Hitler was becoming ever more the control freak as supreme commander. But Stalin, the man of steel who'd bent towards Churchill, was also learning to be less rigid in dealing with his generals. Swallowing his old fear of Bonapartism in the army, Stalin dismantled the system of political commissars, the apparatchiks who could question officers' orders on party or ideological grounds. Now commanders were allowed to take decisions for military reasons alone. Party hacks like Voroshilov were demoted, while Stalin promoted Zhukov to deputy supreme commander.
Zhukov knew the fate of Stalin's generals. At first he tried to refuse the promotion, claiming that their temperaments were incompatible. But Stalin was insistent. Let us subordinate our temperaments to the interests of the motherland.
Zhukov wasn't just a one-man band. Around him he built a capable staff of intelligent and efficient planners. This was a decisive moment, a sign that Stalin had the essential flexibility to survive.
In 1941, Stalin had appealed to nationalism, not communism, in order to galvanize his people for war. In 1942, he compromised again, scrapping the ideology of party control to give his top generals the freedom to fight.
While Russian soldiers battled heroically in the ruins of Stalingrad, Zhukov and his staff formulated a bold plan to relieve the city. And Stalin let them do it, finally releasing the reserves he'd retained to protect Moscow and not pushing Zhukov this time into a premature assault. In November 1942, the pincers closed again, but they were Russian pincers, slicing through weak divisions that guarded the rear of Hitler's army in Stalingrad. It was the Germans who were now encircled. Their final surrender in January 1943 coincided with the 10th anniversary of Hitler's seizure of power. It was a devastating turn of fortune's wheel. War correspondent Vasily Grossman witnessed the Russian victory. Prisoners move on and on in crowds, their mess tins rattling, belted with pieces of rope or wire. Russian troops are marching. Their spirits are higher now. It would be great to get to Kiev. Another man. I'd like to get to Berlin. The Red Army was now on the march. So were the British and Americans by the end of 1942, routing the Germans in North Africa as a springboard for control of the Mediterranean. But it was the Eastern Front, the great battles for Moscow and Stalingrad, that turned World War II, beginning a fight back that would eventually entrench the Soviet Union as a new superpower throughout Eastern Europe. Not just Poland and the Baltic states, but Hungary, Czechoslovakia, and half of Germany itself. The Second World War was a struggle to defeat Hitler's genocidal imperialism. Yet the man who gained most from victory was a dictator as cruel and ruthless as his enemy.
The difference between victory and defeat was in large part that Stalin eventually learned from the mistakes that had cost millions of Russian lives, whereas setbacks only made Hitler more unyielding in his fantasies.
Ultimately, Stalin, for all his Bolshevik ideology, was a pragmatist with a keen eye for survival. Although he was an outsider, his command over the Russian people gained him an empire, bought with their blood, that surpassed anything won by the Tsars. So there was a ghastly moral compromise at the heart of the Allied victory. In 1945, the defeat of one evil helped entrench another evil across half of Europe and in Russia itself.
Having learnt to loosen up his regime to win victory, after the war, Stalin tightened his grip once again, reverting to terror. He put his generals back in their place, demoting the war hero Zhukov on charges of corruption. And he clamped down on his people with renewed censorship and another purge of the party. In the 1950s, Vasily Grossman pondered the cost of victory, reflecting on how the heroism of the war had saved Russia, while also saving Stalin and shoring up the Stalinist system. His epic novel, Life and Fate, was modelled on Tolstoy's War and Peace. At the fulcrum of his book, Grossman evokes Stalin waiting anxiously for the start of Zhukov's vital counteroffensive around Stalingrad. The passage is pure fiction, but also, I think, sublime poetic truth. Grossman imagines the dictator recalling the shambles of 1941, his bumblings that nearly ruined Russia. In his mind's eye, behind Hitler's tanks, Stalin sees the millions of Russians he destroyed coming back to life. The prisoners of the Arctic gulag breaking up through the permafrost, emaciated peasants crawling out of the soil, all of them looking for him. Then Zhukov's pincers close. The Germans cannot escape. Stalingrad will be remembered as a triumph, not a disaster. Grossman now imagines Stalin's devoted secretary, bald little Poskrovyshev, whose wife was one of Stalin's victims, watching silent and motionless as his boss sits back, drinking in the wonderful news. To the victor, the spoils. This was his hour of triumph. He'd not only defeated his current enemy, he had defeated his past. In the villages, the grass would grow thicker over the tombs of 1930. The snow and ice of the Arctic Circle would remain dumb and silent. He knew better than anybody that no one condemns a victor. Very slowly and gently, his eyes closed, he repeated the words of a song. "You're caught in the net, my pretty little bird. I won't let you go for anything in the world." Poskrovyshev looked at Stalin, at his grey, thinning hair, his pockmarked face, his closed eyes. Suddenly, he felt the ends of his fingers grow cold.